to be in fellowship and to be under the ministry of the Word. And Lord, it has been a week. We have so much, Lord, to just lay at your feet and to put in your hands. And I pray, God, that we would do just that. And Lord, that we would adhere to step 2 and just leave them there. That these things that weigh us down, Lord, would be made lighter by your grace. We lift up the teaching this evening, that our hearts would be open to your word, and that we would grow by your word. And we love you and praise you and pray in your name. Amen. So tonight we're going to be picking up in Genesis chapter 26. We will finish kind of our session on the concept of legacy. We discussed the legacy that was passed from Abraham to Isaac, the things that we teach our kids, the things that we teach our neighbors. And we see quite the contrast, don't we, between Abraham and Isaac a little bit. We see kind of in Isaac, not a lot of things that are really that grand. We haven't seen anything so far that's like, oh my goodness, that would be X, Y, and Z, or so amazing, or so hard, or so terrible. We haven't really gotten that out of Isaac yet. And we're going to see more in that concept as we move into chapter 26. And there's a lot to be said for the testings and the trials of faith. We don't want that. Typically, we want to do everything we can to keep the hard stuff away and just absorb some of the easy stuff, to go through the easy stuff in our faith. Because trials in the Spirit, there's just really nothing like it, is there? When we have a trial with our neighbor, we know how to deal with that. We throw trash over their fence, or we put up picket signs, or we gossip and slander and backbite and let our dog go get their newspaper. He does a withdrawal and a deposit. We have general ideas of how to deal with those situations. We have ideas of how we should probably be trying to deal with coworkers, family members. We have something physical and tangible that we can put hands on, put words to, touch, feel, taste, smell, whatever, and fight with. But the spiritual battles, those are the hard ones because they're just that. They're spiritual. And they weigh very heavy on our hearts. And the trials, especially the heavy trials that Abraham went through. Remember his big final test of faith when he was called to go to Mount Moriah with Isaac and offer his son as a sacrifice at Mount Moriah. And we see through the writings in the book of Hebrews that he went by faith because he knew that the promise was going to go through Isaac, who didn't have any children yet. So the promise still had to be fulfilled through Isaac. So the writer of Hebrews uses that Greek word, logizomai, that he came to a solid conclusion. No matter what happens, his son's coming back up that mountain with him. You remember that as Abraham was talking to the herdsmen, don't we, the servants? He said, me and the lad are going to go up to the mountain to worship. We will come back to you. And then we see kind of this different nature, this more kind of just a solid posturing with Abraham. Now, granted, we've seen him kind of go back and forth through his trips and his journeys. But what he learned, I believe full well that he certainly passed down to Isaac, and we see some of that in Isaac's life. We're going to see a lot more of it tonight. But there truly is something to be said for the trials and the testings of faith, and it draws quite the contrast to those Christians that do everything they can to avoid them. But I think that was more of a side note. So, chapter 26. There was a famine in the land, besides the first famine that was in the days of Abraham. I already like how the chapter just kind of kicks off. Where's Isaac right now? He's in the promised land. He is in the place that God has called him to be. This brings a great point for the church. Just because God's called you to be there doesn't mean it's going to be easy. Just because God's called you to be there doesn't mean it's going to be pretty. A famine in a land that, at least depending on where he was, already looks kind of dry and arid and like you don't want to be there. I can only imagine what a famine would do to that particular kind of situation. And Isaac went to Abimelech, king of the Philistines in Gerar. Now we get to see some of the other things that Isaac has learned. The things that were passed down to him by his father. You remember, as soon as we were really picking up on our journey with Abraham, he leaves Ur of the Chaldees, goes up north, stays there for about 15 years. Finally, we have a patriarch in the family that passes, so he decides to continue moving south. He comes into the land, he builds an altar. He moves all the way down to the south to Bethel, he builds an altar. He keeps on going into Egypt. Why? Because there was a famine in the land, and he was afraid. So they're making their way down towards Egypt. And a lot of people bring up the idea, well, if there's a famine in the land of Canaan, wouldn't that famine also affect Egypt? Yes, probably. But what's interesting about Egypt, if you get on any of the maps and look at the imagery of Egypt, you see this intricate and amazing and a gorgeous river system in northern Egypt, northern and northeastern Egypt. So there was still water there for all the herds. So we see Isaac doing the exact same thing. What's interesting is Isaac does the same thing as the kings. In 5 years, we'll get to 1st and 2nd Chronicles and 1st and 2nd Kings. In their fear, in their doubts, and in their worries, what did they do? They tethered themselves to Gentile kings. They were paying homage to Syria, Assyria, and to Egypt to protect them against either the northern, so Judah's paying someone to protect them from Israel. Israel's paying someone else to protect them from Judah. Back and forth. And in the prophets it says that you're giving your strength. You're giving all your strength away to these nations. We as a people do it now. Whenever we start to see that the cupboards are getting a little bit bare, talking to the concept of the famine, what's our plan B? We always try and have a plan B. We always try to go somewhere else except to our knees or except to the word. So here we see Isaac right out the gate going to Abimelech, king of the Philistines in Gerar. Remember Abimelech? Who is Abimelech? So we ran into Abimelech several chapters ago with Abraham and Sarah and the inhabitants of the land of the Philistines, which is what this is, recognize, oh, Sarah's pretty. Abraham still going with his plan A. If anybody asks, we're just going to call this a SOP, a standard operating procedure. If anybody asks, you're my sister. And that's what they do. And she, for the second time, ends up in the harem of a different king. And then the king has this vision and this conversation with God. And God says, indeed, you're a dead man because you have taken a married man's wife. So he shut up the wombs of the Philistine women. And then he rebuked Abraham, gave back Sarah, allowed Abraham to stay in the land. People have a lot of fighting over Abimelech. Is this the same Abimelech from Abraham's time at about 100 years old? I kind of doubt it. That's a long-living Abimelech. Josephus, a first century historian, believes it's the same Abimelech, that this Abimelech is the friend of Abraham. But you have to keep in mind, Abimelech is probably a lot like the name Herod or Caesar. It is either a family name like the Herods or a throne name like the Caesars. Not all the Caesars were actually, they took on that name. And we see the Herods kind of doing the exact same thing. So that's probably what this is. If it's the same guy that was a friend of Abraham, then he's really old and he's probably still got a fresh memory of Abraham. Otherwise, we're going to see what has been passed down to this Abimelech. Then the Lord appeared to him and said, do not go down to Egypt. Live in the land which I shall tell you. Dwell in this land. Isaac was not planning on staying in Gerar. Abraham was planning on going back down to Egypt. And that's kind of an interesting concept, isn't it? Egypt, through the word is always a picture of what? It's always a picture of the world. His first instinct is to return to the world for support, or just return to, if you will, the old life. We get jaded about it sometimes. When we come to the cross and we're broken or yearning or whatever it is, the more time we spend in the walk and we hit kind of a rough patch, we start looking back on things. And we've talked about that before. I look often at my military career. It's like, man, those are some of the best years of my life. And I reflect on it consistently. Megan always got a weird look on her face. I can't figure out why. But then I hook up with I still talk with a lot of good military friends. We start sharing stories. Like, man, that was terrible. Those were some of the worst years. It's easy to get jaded. You remember after the Exodus, they're wandering through the desert, and they're complaining against Moses and Aaron. They're brought out into the wilderness just to die before their period of disobedience at the border. And you see them trying to raise up leaders for themselves to take them back into Egypt. Do you remember why? Because of the dates. I don't know if you've ever had a date. I'm not real fond of them. Iraq and Afghanistan, they're very fond of them. It's a nut. Like a squishy one. Dates. They completely, the fruit, not that date. The food. They were strongly considering going back into bondage for food. Not even good food. Not tacos or meatloaf, but dates. We get kind of jaded about those things. So we start going back into our normal habits because it's always kind of there, nipping at the back of our mind. So his first instinct was to go back to the world for support. And it's interesting how we see God working with Isaac so that he would not go down to Egypt. And he does that by stating the rest of verse 3 and 4. And I will be with you and bless you. For to you and your descendants I give all these lands. And I will perform the oath which I swore to Abraham your father. And I will make your descendants multiply as the stars of heaven. I will give to your descendants all these lands, and in your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. Because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. We'll come back to verse 5 towards the end of the chapter. But we see a reiteration of the promise. Why do we see a reiteration of the promise verbally? Because they didn't have all this yet. So it really should kind of highlight for us an interesting point, an essential point for the believer. You're often, as you've probably noticed, you're going to have those times when you just want to go back to the way you did it in the world. Man, when I had this stressful of a week, I just want a Bahama Mama. The drink, not the hot dog, which is equally good. This is when I would call my friends. We would go to the bars. Oh, this is why I started smoking. Whatever it is. I like to just shut myself up, shut everybody else out, and just handle my business. Here, God is reminding Isaac. He's reiterating the promise. For us, the same thing. Go back to the Word. That promise being shown or told again and again is one of those things that would strengthen Isaac. And he highlights, again, the three aspects to the covenant. That it involves the land, it involves a nation, and it involves a blessing. All three of these things probably attacking the three things that are hurting the heart or the mind, fears, worries, and such, of Isaac. So, Isaac dwelt in Gerar. We see Isaac essentially staying and obeying in faith. And the men of the place asked about his wife. And he said, "She is my sister." For he was afraid to say, "She is my wife," because the thought, lest the men of this place kill me for Rebekah, because she is beautiful to behold. Man, round 3 with the exact same lie. If you didn't have any real solid genealogy in the last few chapters, you can figure out real quick whose kid this is. We've heard that. Oh, the apple doesn't fall far from it. You're just like your dad. Or, oh, you take after your mother. We hear it a lot. We say it a lot. And we see Isaac doing the exact same thing. And a lot of people really like to kind of jump into the deep end and go with, well, this is one of those generational sins. It's one of those generational curses that just stick with the family forever. Something that's still taught wrongly. This is something that he learned from his father and from his mother that seems to have snuck its way into his life. He has this choice in it. And we see the exact same verbiage as used in 2 other chapters. We see him doing 2 other things. So in chapter 25, we got to see a lot of the good aspects, the good pieces of legacy that Abraham had passed down to Isaac. Here in chapter 26, we're kind of starting to see some of the bad habits. When we have that sign of trouble, and famine is a legitimate trouble. We really can't underestimate that one at all. We are by really no means in a famine, but we kind of see what happens, especially in this type of area, when water gets a little bit low. Everybody else is seeing from a grander aspect what happens when you can't really get parts. Lumber was scarce, electrical parts are scarce, mechanical parts are scarce, and things just kind of slow down or dissipate and fade away. So famine is one of his big tests of faith, because we notice it was one of the first ones, well, second, that Abraham failed. He was called to go into a land that he didn't know, out of a very beautiful land. And he went. He was supposed to leave his family behind. They went with him. He was supposed to go to the land that God would show him. He stopped someplace else just at the border for 15 years. When he finally moves into the land, he sees the famine and moves out of the land about as fast as he got in there. So we see Isaac, so far, the same 2 hang-ups that Abraham had. Verse 8, now it came to pass, when he had been there a long time, that Abimelech, king of the Philistines, looked through a window and saw, and there was Isaac, showing endearment to Rebekah, his wife. I like the King James word that they use. They use sporting. He was sporting with his wife. Probably a form of flirting. It's just kind of interesting. We always think we're so sneaky in our sin. Not really paying attention that the enemy does everything he can to gain dirt, throw dirt. But the world is always watching. The world is always seeking, either to throw dirt or to figure out why, regardless of what's going on all around you, that you still move forward in joy. So they're always watching. And Abraham's not that sneaky. So verse 9, then Abimelech called Isaac and said, quite obviously she is your wife. So how could you say she is my sister? Isaac said to him, because I said, lest I die on account of her. I brought this up in a hypothetical situation with Megan last night. It went about the way you would expect it to. But the thing I want to focus on, and this would make a great secondary study that I do not have time for tonight, how or why is it quite obvious? I really love the dynamic of the husband and the wife team. Here, even though they're trying to essentially hide their union because he doesn't want to die, quite obviously she is his wife. I don't know, there's something about that verse that just stood out to me last night while I was studying. Again, it's a side study we can't get to, but is it obvious that your spouse is your spouse? How do you treat each other? They were treating each other well enough that they were able to figure out that they were husband and wife. how you treat each other in the home and outside of the home is incredibly important. It really does. It really is something of a force multiplier, especially when you have kids in the home. How you and your spouse interact speaks volumes to the kids. Daughters learn how men are supposed to treat them. Men learn how to be men and how to treat women properly. When you deviate from that and people see it, kids grow up with a different thought process. And it's something that the church, it's something that everybody that's married really should be paying attention to. How you interact with one another is very important, especially as a church and especially outside the walls when everybody else is looking at you and they see your marriage tethered together by the bonds of the Spirit. I think we will turn that into a Bible study, but not right now. And Abimelech said, "What is this that you have done to us? One of the people might soon have lain with your wife, and you would have brought guilt on us." From Abraham and from Isaac, you never see the end of plan B. We see God interceding in all situations. We see him protecting the covenant, protecting the promise. But realistically, what was the rest of his plan? His wife can't live in somebody else's harem forever. And now, for the second time, we see those who are essentially not believers rebuking those that are. And one of the hard part, maybe not so hard, but something for us to also consider is whenever we have that real deep spiritual experience or that mountaintop experience, we see God in communion with Isaac, restating the process, not the process, the promise. And it's enough to make him not go to Egypt, which was his plan. And then right after that, we see him do something dumb. The upside is a lot of us have been there or are there right now, or, not to bring you down, but you're probably going to be there soon. We see Peter kind of do the same thing, don't we? When Jesus asked his disciples at the gates, "Who do people say that I am?" And they prattled off this list. So Jesus asked them, "Who do you say that I am?" Not Jesus, but Peter. "Oh, you're the Son of God." He's like, "Blessed are you because the Spirit has revealed this to you." And then Jesus says the Son of Man is going to die at the hands. And what does Peter do? Peter tries rebuking Jesus. "Not so, Lord." So Jesus tells Peter, "Get behind me, Satan." So just something for us to kind of watch out for. So Abimelech charged all his people, saying, "He who touches this man or his wife shall surely be put to death." That sounds familiar, doesn't it? Now we get to see what Abimelech has either learned from his father or has remembered from his dealings with Abraham. I typically lean more towards the former. Josephus does call this the same Abimelech that is the friend of Abraham. But especially looking at it as the father-son kind of dynamic, of all the things you would touch your kids, or not touch your kids, you would tell your kids, never touch a child of Abraham. Don't touch anything of Abraham's. If you ever see Abraham or any kind of Abrahamite, stay away from him. Help him out, show him around, show him out. Like, just don't touch anything or look at anything. We see what he has learned and still putting into practice. So Abimelech charged those people. "He touches this man or his wife shall surely be put to death." He remembers. And Isaac sowed in the land and reaped in the same year 100-fold. And the Lord blessed him. And the man began to prosper and continued prospering until he became very prosperous. For he had possessions of flocks, possessions of herds, great number of servants. So the Philistines envied him. Now we're starting to see a little bit of division coming in. When one is growing and multiplying above the other, it's going to cause envy. But it's also going to cause what? Fear. The other Abimelech is dealing with Abraham, recognize that Abraham is becoming very great. So if Abraham wanted to take something, he probably could because he had that growing number of servants, that growing number of warriors, growing amount of wealth. We're starting to see the same situation here. Now the Philistines had stopped up all the wells, which his father's servants had dug in the days of Abraham his father, and they had filled them with earth. And Abimelech said to Isaac, "Go away from us, for you are much mightier than we." So we see kind of a bold move by Abimelech. He's stopping up the wells, rediverting the water. Water to somebody nomadic in the desert is more precious than gold. Isaac has a lot of flocks. Abraham has a lot of people that also need water. Water is essential for survival anywhere, but especially here in this situation. And they're stopping up the wells. They're doing everything they can to stop Isaac. I really like this passage. And I really like the next verse where it says, Abimelech said to Isaac, "Go away from us, for you are much mightier than we." It'd be really easy to look at the situation like, man, Abimelech, what a bad guy. What a dirtbag. He's stealing water. He's stopping up wells. He's jealous. He's trying to get rid of Isaac out of the land. He's kind of being dirty about it. You have to remember, Isaac's not supposed to be there. Isaac's supposed to be in his land. Granted, it's a hard place, and it's probably still a little bit of an ugly place, but that is where he is supposed to be. We'll discuss it in a little bit more detail when we get to Jacob. But when God is trying to move you, we typically take the place of the ox or the donkey. How many of us have tried to move an animal that didn't want to move? You got to change something to make that animal move. Trying to stand behind it and kicking it in the rear doesn't really always do it. So we see here, when God is readying Isaac to go back, we have a change of circumstance and a change of relationship. He's using these two things to kind of start herding Isaac back in the direction that he is supposed to go. And Isaac dug again the wells of water, which they had dug in the days of Abraham his father, for the Philistines had stopped them up after the death of Abraham. He called them by the names which his father had called them. Also Isaac's servants dug in the valley and found a well of running water there. I feel like I skipped a verse. I did, verse 17. Then Isaac departed from there and pitched his tent in the valley of Gerar and dwelt there. So God is readying to move Isaac. We don't like that. When God is readying us to pick up and to go somewhere, it typically forces us to move a little bit out of our comfort zone. Megan and myself, when we helped plant the church in Gooding, we were very content. We were very thrilled. The children's ministry, we were both serving side by side in the children's ministry, and it was flourishing. It was just awesome. We did puppet shows. We had quite the dispute about puppet shows last night. We had a great time. We're trying to plant new ministries. That was my first indicator. I was teaching adults on Sunday nights, teaching through the Old Testament, teaching Genesis. It's my moving book. We were trying to start an Awanas program in Gooding, and we would go across the street to an assisted care facility, and we were starting a ministry there Sunday afternoons so that they would be able to hear the word as well. None of the ministries were mine. They weren't mine to start. They weren't mine to finish. It just felt weird. So we kind of clammed up back into what we had. On top of that, we were trying to buy a house for 3 years, and it was not panning out. Those 3 years we lived in an office, trying to find a house, trying to figure out where we were going. In that time, a lot of our relationships had changed, not just in the family front, but also in the workplace. It was starting to get very uncomfortable. So I did everything I could to continue to make myself comfortable. Verse 17, Isaac says he departed from there and pitched his tent in the valley of Gerar. He didn't go very far. Sometimes that ox is a little bit hard to move. For Megan and myself, it took a little bit of a bomb someone flat out, two people, one that prophesied over me, and then we met the pastor that flat out asked me, told me, I need you in Homedale. So we came home, we prayed. I was ready to go. I was super excited because God was just doing something. Megan, not so much. So she went to the Word. And what she read readied her heart. And the next day we started our move. So we see something similar here. Change in circumstance, change in relationships. Verse 20, but the herdsmen of Gerar quarreled with Isaac's herdsmen, saying, the water is ours. So he called the name of the well Esek, or contention, because they quarreled with him. Then they dug another well, and they quarreled over that one also. So he called the name Sitnah, or enmity. And he moved from there and dug another well, and they did not quarrel over it. So he called its name Rehoboth, because he said, for now the Lord has made room for us, which means room. And we shall be fruitful in the land. Then he went up from there to Beersheba. Isaac goes back. And the Lord appeared to him the same night and said, I am the God of your father Abraham. Do not fear, for I am with you. I will bless you, multiply your descendants for my servant Abraham's sake. Such a powerful verse. So we see, just like we did with Abraham, he moves forward in obedience. He begins to move forward in faith. Other commentators might argue he's moving home because he has to. But it's interesting, as soon as he sets foot back in the land, God is speaking to him again. And he lays out three things. We see a command. We see a promise, and we see a blessing. The command is, do not fear. We saw the same thing with Abraham after the battle of the 9 kings. We remember the king of Sodom came out, and Abraham refused him. And in the next chapter, God says, do not be afraid. Says the same thing, probably for the same reasons here. He's just made angry a neighbor. There's nothing worse than that, is there? Neighbors are supposed to protect one another. Keep an eye on each other's house. They're the ones that feed your dog or yell at your dog, depending on the kind of dog you have. They're the ones that watch over the place. They're the ones that go over there and water your house. If they see someone doing something weird, they're the ones that notify you of it. But what happens when your neighbors are your enemies? That's the worst. Because you can't trust anything that's going on your property. You see fences get taller. You see Yorkies turn into pit bulls. You see a lot of things just change. It would make sense that he would be afraid. Not just for the contention, but he's also going back to what? He's going back into bare cupboards. He's going back into the famine. So God tells him, do not be afraid. Because that's also our plan A. Something comes up that we don't like, or is hard, or causes us to worry. The big one these days, jobs. Man, the stuff that the government's doing. And it's everywhere. We have to wear masks. We have to be vaccinated. Well, people don't want to. Some people don't want to. So we see some of the reins kind of tighten down a little bit. A lot of veterans rely on, well, I have my pension, or I have this, I have that. Well, some of the remarks that have been made in the last few weeks, well, they're going to stop those too until people are vaccinated. So we see quite the effect, and it's hitting everybody's wells. They're kind of stopping up the wells, filling up the wells. That's a very fearful thing, and it causes people to worry, causes people to dread, causes people to forget the next part, I am with you. We allow our problems to grow bigger than God. And God says, I will bless you. And here's the part that always kind of strikes my heart. I will bless you and multiply your descendants for my servant Abraham's sake. Not for Isaac's sake. We really get it in our heads. If I want to be blessed by God, I think one of my favorite phrases is from John Corson. He's like, if you want to stand in the spout where the blessings come out, I have to be a good boy. I have to be a good girl. I have to be obedient. I have to mind my P's and Q's. I have to do. If I'm not working properly, I am not going to be blessed by God. It's easy to look at ourselves, or it's easy to look at somebody else and say, you don't deserve the blessings. You don't deserve grace. You're right. We don't. Isaac was blessed for Abraham's sake. For the believer, as we just went through the book of Romans, you are blessed for Christ's sake. He did that. Those blessings pour out on you because of what he did. That's why it is grace. It's a gift. It's us getting something that we do not deserve. So he built an altar there and called on the name of the Lord. He pitched his tent there, and there Isaac's servants dug a well. Love this verse too. We see three things that Isaac is stepping back into: worship, abiding, and refreshing. And it's interesting how it goes in that order. First thing he does is he goes into worshiping God. When we begin to worship God, it calls us into a deeper place with Christ, in a place of abiding in Christ and with Christ, and we know as believers that have tasted the grace that it is refreshing. Then Abimelech came to him from Gerar with Ahuzath, one of his friends, and Phicol, the commander of his army. We remember Phicol. Could be the same guy, could be something of a title. But his neighbors show up. And Isaac said to them, "Why have you come to me since you hate me and have sent me away from you?" Very legitimate question. Isaac probably would have been maybe a little fearful, but likely a little bit hesitant. But it is a legitimate question. But they said, "We have certainly seen that the Lord is with you." How interesting is that? And we're going to talk about his change of circumstance. But they are noticing. We have seen the Lord is with you. What has changed? Well, now they're not mooching out of the land of the Philistines, but now he is still being blessed. He is still growing in a land that is riddled with famine. So we said, "Let there now be an oath between us, between you and us, and let us make a covenant with you, that you will do us no harm, since we have not touched you, and since we have done nothing to you but good, and sent you away in peace. You are now the blessed of the Lord." Kind of an interesting concept, isn't it? We see a complete change in Abimelech. He wasn't really sent away in peace. Doesn't say anywhere that he was touched, but they stopped up all his wells. They made it absolutely impossible. Man, the change. The world is watching. Such an important thing to keep in mind as the body. They're seeing what we are doing. When they look out, they should see Christians flourishing in the famine. Why? Because you're the only ones that can. That's what's so amazing about the desert flowers. You've seen some of the prettiest flowers in the desert. And it really, how did that get there? We see this flourishing there. We see believers flourishing in those hard situations, and now they are coming to seek a blessing, essentially, out of Isaac. They want to have that oath with him. How does Isaac respond? So he made them a feast, and they ate and drank. So we see something of a neat insight into his character. How could he have responded? I'm not always the nicest person. They stopped up his wells. I'd have given them cups of sand. Drink up. There's a whole horde of things he could have done. But we see something long before its time, that it was written in the Proverbs: a soft answer turns away wrath. Then they rose early in the morning and swore an oath with one another, and Isaac sent them away, and they departed from him in peace. It came to pass the same day that Isaac's servants came up and told him about the well which they had dug, and said to him, "We have found water." So he called it Sheba. Therefore the name of the city is Beersheba to this day. Williams, another commentator, has this to say about the section. It is when Isaac definitely separates himself from the men of Gerar that they come to him seeking blessing from God. The Christian best helps the world when living in separation from it. Kind of a powerful concept, isn't it? If someone's drowning, you don't throw them a brick. For Christians to be effective as a witness, as an ambassador, as salt, as light, it has to be separated. Salt has to be salt. If you hand somebody sugar to put in something that's supposed to have salt, or vice versa, funny but ineffective. We can't witness to the world by doing the exact same thing that the world is doing. Why? Because if you're doing the exact same thing, they don't need you. Why did God change the circumstance and relationships of Isaac? He could not be effective where he was. We saw something similar with Abraham. The only thing he could do was to pray for Abimelech, because no other form of testimony or witness would have been accepted by Abimelech. And the same goes for Isaac. Until he was fully separated. It's easy for them. Yeah, no wonder you're multiplying and you're blessed and you're fruitful and you're doing well. You're stealing all my stuff. You've got all my water. Who knows how many of my goats and my sheep you have in your midst. Go back to your land. So he goes back into a harsh situation, a situation riddled with famine. And they are doing great. Abimelech, Phicol, those see him doing great, prospering in an impossible situation, causes them to realize that certainly the Lord is with you. And now they seek blessing from the one that is with the Lord. Verse 34, when Esau was 40 years old, he took as wives Judith, the daughter of Beeri, the Hittite, and Basemath, the daughter of Elon the Hittite. And they were a grief of mind to Isaac and Rebekah. Josephus points out two things. First, that these were the daughters, basically, of kings. And it was a grief of mind to his parents. Why? It demonstrates, pretty straightforward, that he truly is unfit for the birthright. He took wives from somewhere that Abraham definitely didn't want wives taken from. But these wives are important. If they were the daughters of kings, what is Esau doing? He's setting himself up. We've seen throughout the course of our history, not so much for us now, at least in America, but when a son took a daughter from somebody else that was a king, they're uniting the families. He's trying to strengthen himself with something that he wasn't supposed to. He was becoming unequally yoked. And he did it with two separate ones. So it became something of a burden to the parents. He also points out, and we'll see it, that Isaac and Rebekah stayed silent about it, which we'll see that grow into a problem into the next chapter. Chapters 25 and 26 certainly show us two real prominent spiritual truths. First, the legacy you're choosing to leave behind is important. Make it count. As we discussed last week, the legacy shouldn't be about stuff. The legacy shouldn't be about circumstance, but it should be about God. It should be about your testimony, your life, your walk with God. Because just as we saw with Isaac, he's going to end up in the same, just like our kids have, haven't they? They end up in the same situations that we've ended up in. How have we taught them to respond to that situation? And two, in those hard situations, how important it is to make sure that we are separated to God. He is the reason that we don't have to fear, because he is with us, and he is the source of our blessing. He is the source of real blessing. Two important truths that we see kind of pop up in chapter 26. Let's pray together. Lord, thank you so much for the evening. And thank you so much, Lord, for the truth of your word. We're very thankful, God, that any time that we choose to, we can go back into your word, that we can see the promises you've left for your people, the promises you've left for Israel, the promises, Lord, that you have left to us as the church, to your bride. And Lord, as the storms certainly will continue to press, I pray, God, that instead of turning back to the world for support, we turn back to the place, Lord, that you have given us always, to your word, and to be able to come to you boldly in prayer. And we love you and we praise you and we pray in your name. Amen.